Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. This week, reports emerged that President Biden is getting ready to endorse some changes to the Supreme Court. Here to explain what these changes are and if they're even at all possible is Kermit Roosevelt. He is a professor at Penn Law. Professor Roosevelt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just start at the top. What are these changes that people are talking about and that some members of society want to see made to the Supreme Court?
Well, we don't know exactly which changes Biden might endorse, but there are several out there that are getting the most attention. And I should say I was a member of President Biden's Supreme Court Reform Commission, so I was talking about these with other experts. And what I'm hearing is that he's most likely to suggest one or more of an enforceable ethics code, term limits for Supreme Court justices, or possible but least likely actually court expansion, adding justices to the court.
Let's take those one at a time. You say ethics code, and, businesses have ethics codes, other parts of government have ethics codes. Does the Supreme Court not have a code of ethics right now? What's the deal?
Well, it really doesn't. So there's, for a long time, been a code of ethics for federal judges, which sets out things that they're not supposed to do, and maybe most importantly, circumstances under which they should recuse themselves. They should not hear particular cases if their impartiality could reasonably be questioned. And that code actually does say that it applies to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court for a long time said, no, you can't bind us, we're too important, basically. And then they also said for a while, but we follow this code on our own. And then it turned out they really weren't doing that. Some of the revelations about Clarence Thomas, some of the behavior by Samuel Alito really seems to violate the code that binds all the other federal judges. So partially in reaction to outrage about that, the Supreme Court then said, we've got an ethics code now, like we've written our own ethics code. But no one else can enforce it. We're going to enforce it ourselves. So again, they were saying no one else can tell us what to do. And, here's this code and maybe we'll follow it, maybe we won't, but no one can do anything if we don't. And obviously that's not a good look for the court. And I think it's sort of problematic as a state of affairs for one branch of our government to be saying, we're basically the only people who can decide whether what we're doing is okay or not. So I have a lot of sympathy for the idea of an enforceable ethics code. I think the details might get a little bit tricky because it actually is a pretty big step for Congress to say to some Supreme Court justices, you can't decide this case. So
you bring up
I'm
Congress.
Not sure what the details will be like.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was just about to ask because you use the phrase enforceable ethics code and you just mentioned Congress. So is Congress the most likely entity to be the one to enforce that if that were to go in place?
Well, Congress would be the one to write it. So one thing to keep in mind is most of this, we'll get to term limits, but most of this is going to be done through ordinary legislation. So it has to pass both houses of Congress and it has to be signed by the president. And Biden is now saying, I'm willing to do this, but the Republican-controlled House is presumably not. So none of this will happen before the election. None of this will happen if Biden is not elected. None of this will happen if the Democrats don't get control of both houses of Congress. So this is sort of a campaign promise that Biden is making. Not, I'll do this now, but if you reelect me and we get control of Congress, I'll do this.
So it's more like a liberal wish list at this point in time.
Yeah, I think strategically what's going on is Biden is reaching out to the progressive wing of his party, which has long wanted court reform. And he's been resistant to that. He's been more of a centrist institutionalist.
Now, you mentioned term limits, and this is something that has come up in other branches of government. We saw in North Dakota legislation, local legislation, I should note, setting a maximum age for folks running for office there. It's obviously been in the news with President Biden's health and age as he runs for re-election. Does the political climate that we're in right now make that a more bipartisan issue and something that is more, a piece of reform that is more likely to pass?
Well, it used to have pretty broad bipartisan support. And the important thing to understand about term limits, I think, is it's not really a response to the problem of people getting too old. That would be an age limit, and it would be a little bit ironic maybe for Biden to be pushing for term limits on that basis. And it's not even really a response to the problem of people serving for too long, although I think there is an issue with justices serving for 30 or even 40 years. The real problem that term limits is supposed to address is about the composition of the Supreme Court and the influence that each president has over the Supreme Court. So under our current system, how many appointments does a president get? No one knows. It could be 0, like Jimmy Carter. It could be 3 in one term, like Donald Trump. And how much influence a president has over the Supreme Court is sort of random. It's affected by whether a justice unexpectedly dies, and it's sort of controlled by the justices themselves, because they usually time their retirements so that their replacement will be appointed by a president who shares their values. So what that means is there's no predictable way in which the composition of the Supreme Court is tied to anything other than random chance and partisan behavior. And that's just not a good way to decide which of our two political parties gets to control the Supreme Court. So the founders, when they drafted the Constitution, they weren't thinking about political parties. They didn't imagine that two parties would be fighting for the Supreme Court as a power center within the government. But that's what's happening now, and everyone understands it does matter who the justices are. It matters whether a Democrat or a Republican appoints them. So it would make a lot more sense if we had a system where if you win a national election, right, the Democrats win the presidency, they get to put 2 justices on the Supreme Court. And the point of term limits is if you take the justices off or move them to senior status or something like that every 18 years, so that each justice has an active term of 18 years, then with a 9-member court, you get 2 vacancies per presidential term. Each president gets to appoint 2 justices per 4-year term, and that way each president has an equal impact on the composition of the Supreme Court. And I think that a lot of the problems that we're seeing now come from the fact that the court is so out of step with the American people. And it's out of step because we've got a 6-3 Republican supermajority, even though the Republicans have lost 5 of the last 8 presidential elections. So term limits is really a sort of structural fix to that problem.
The other policy proposal or reform that you hear in some parts of the political system is expanding the court, which that to me feels like the most unlikely. But what's your view? I know that's been kind of a call we've heard out of the left over the last few years, precisely because of that supermajority that you have referenced.
Right. So I think that is the most unlikely, although I understand why people are calling for it. So if you agree with the analysis that I was giving you before about term limits and how, it would make sense for control over the Supreme Court to be determined by whether or not you win presidential elections, then you can adopt term limits and you'll get there eventually. If you follow the term limits plan, the court will come back in line with the American people in maybe 20 years, because term limits wouldn't apply to the sitting justices. For the composition of the court to even out, it's going to take a while. You have to somehow get rid of the overrepresentation of Republican justices. You have to just wait for them to retire. So if you don't want to wait 20 years, if you think the court is a current danger to American democracy, if you're really upset about some of its decisions and you think they're just beyond the pale, and you want to bring it back right now to where it would have been if we'd been doing 2 justices per 4-year presidential term, then what you want to do is give the Democrats control. So that's what court expansion would do.
What is your opinion on the significance of the reports that indicate that President Biden intends to support reforms like this? Is this a really definitive moment in time that he's considering this?
Well, it's definitely a big change for him. So when Biden created the Commission on Reform, I thought, that's great, he's really taking this seriously. Cynical people said, oh no, commissions are where ideas go to die. And it turned out the commission, did a pretty good job, I think, with its report. We weren't supposed to make recommendations, and we didn't, although I think it was evident that term limits had the most support. But we gave a pretty good survey of what the options are. We said, here's what you could consider doing. And the administration really didn't seem to be motivated to take any action on that. So I think it's a big change, and I think it's a positive change that Biden is now talking about supporting this. Because, as I said, it used to be that constitutional law professors and scholars on both sides of the political spectrum did agree that term limits were a good idea. Once the Republicans got what looks like a durable supermajority, Republican support for that eroded because it started looking more like a partisan issue. And it would have a partisan effect in that it would take away what seems otherwise a more or less permanent Republican majority. But I don't think the best reading of the Constitution is that the Republicans should forever control the Supreme Court. So I think you can have a nonpartisan argument in favor of term limits.
Now, you mentioned the founding fathers weren't ever imagining that the political system would get this divisive and that we'd see so much fighting between the two parties over the Supreme Court. I want to zoom out a little bit and ask you, how much about the court is settled law and was determined by the Constitution, and how much more could it change? Because I think the idea of changes to the court, it's a little surprising if you really think about it in the context of history.
Well, it is a little surprising, but maybe it shouldn't be as surprising as we think. So the Constitution says a few things about the Supreme Court. It says some things about its jurisdiction, although it does explicitly give Congress the power to make regulations and exceptions for the Supreme Court's appellate jurisdiction. And it says that the judges shall hold their office during good behavior, which is understood to mean life tenure. It doesn't say what size the Supreme Court should be. And actually, the Supreme Court has changed in size over the years. It started out at 6. It was increased up to 9. The Republicans made it 10 to give Lincoln an extra appointment. After Lincoln was assassinated, they shrank it. A similar thing happened with Jefferson. Jefferson's opponents tried to deny him appointments by manipulating the size of the court. So it's happened. And actually, some people would say that that's what the Republican Senate did when they refused to consider Merrick Garland. They shrank the size of the court to 8, effectively, and then they brought it back up to 9 to allow Trump to make an appointment. So changing the size of the Supreme Court, it is within Congress's power, and it has been done in the past. Nonetheless, people think that it's the most radical because I think it's the most partisan. It clearly looks partisan. Now, term limits, on the other hand, I've been saying that really is a nonpartisan good government solution to a problem that we have. Our appointments process for the Supreme Court just doesn't make sense. That, however, is a little more radical constitutionally speaking, because there might be problems with the constitutional provision that says judges shall hold their office during good behavior. So if you said you're a Supreme Court justice for 18 years and then you're not a Supreme Court justice anymore, that would violate the Constitution. And the way that people have tried to get around this is by saying, here's what it means to be a Supreme Court justice. You will sit in regular active service for 18 years, and then after that you will do something else. You will maybe decide cases on the courts of appeals or something like that. And that's what retired Supreme Court justices do now. And the interesting thing about this proposal is that the US Supreme Court has said a judge who takes senior status, which is what the justices do when they retire, is still a judge. They still hold the office. So it seems possible, based on that precedent, to say, well, we're going to move people to a slightly different set of job descriptions, but we're not removing them from the office of judge. And in fact, you still address retired Supreme Court justices as associate justice. According to the Supreme Court, they are still Supreme Court justices. So it seems like technically maybe you could do this without a constitutional amendment, but that's certainly not clear.
That is so interesting. So it is technically legal, but then there are technicalities that you would have to abide by to put those term limits in place.
Yeah, and I think it would ultimately end up in court, and ultimately the Supreme Court would be the one deciding it.
Oh, well, that's more meta.
A whole different puzzle. Yeah.
That
and
breaks my brain a little
some
bit.
what some people have suggested is we don't think the Supreme Court's going to like the idea of term limits, so we should package them in a bill. And we say, here's the term limits, and if you invalidate term limits, then 4 seats are immediately added to the Supreme Court. So if you don't let us have term limits, we're going to do expansion.
Oh, wow. That's spicy, for lack of a better word. That really sets up more political fighting. And I want to talk to you about recent polling. And when I say recent, it's not just this year. This is a trend that's been brewing over the past several years. show that the American public doesn't have the most favorable view of the Supreme Court. And that's a big change from when I was a kid and 10, 20, 30 years ago. What was the precipitating factor, in your view, in the decline in public opinion of the Supreme Court? And is it ever likely to go back to more neutral, uncontroversial territory?
Well, I think there's a pretty clear answer as to why the American public views the Supreme Court as negatively as it does. And part of it has to do with the ethical violations, which are just a bad look. I mean, whatever you think about what effect it has on his decisions, and I think probably the effect is pretty small if it exists at all, it just looks very bad for Justice Thomas to be going on these fancy vacations with the multi-billionaires who actually have interest in cases before the court. Mm-hmm. So that's bad. That's one thing. I think what's more important is that the Supreme Court looks more and more as though it's representing a pretty extreme ideology that's held by a pretty small minority of the American people. So the Supreme Court looks like it's out of step with mainstream American public opinion and also mainstream American constitutional thinking. And there's a reason for that, which is that you've got this 6-3 supermajority, even though Republicans lost 5 of the last 8 elections. And if you've been following the presidential elections, we should have, in fact, a 6-3 Democratic majority. So what that means is the Supreme Court is pretty far away, 6 justices away, from where it would have been if we'd been giving each president 2 appointments per 4-year term. And the last time it was this far away, so this is almost unprecedented in American history, the last time it was this far away was when it decided the Dred Scott case in 1858. So I think there's a lesson to be taken from this, which is when the Supreme Court gets too far away from mainstream American public opinion, it starts to advance views that the American people don't like, and understandably, they react against that.
I just got goosebumps because that indicates to me that some of the more unpopular decisions, not just from this term, obviously we saw the outcry over the Chevron case, but if you go back 2 years to Dobbs, Roe v. Wade could still be law if these reforms had taken place, in your view?
Yes, absolutely.
What would the ability of the court be if these reforms were to take place going forward to change some of these recent decisions? You know, I mentioned the Chevron case. We saw some other decisions that were effectively non-decisions on matters of reproductive health. Would term limits or an expanded court go back and review those cases, or would it just affect the cases yet to be argued?
Well, that's always up to the justices. And the Supreme Court as an institution, I think generally they don't like to look as though the outcome is changing just because the judges have changed, because that makes it look like it's the judges and not the law. So that's one of the reasons, the sort of institutional self-preservation, that the Supreme Court usually follows the doctrine of stare decisis, and it's reluctant to overrule prior decisions without a good reason. But of course, we've just seen a whole bunch of decisions abandoning the principle of stare decisis and overruling earlier decisions that were fundamental to the structure of American society and that people had relied on for 50 years, like Roe v. Wade. So the goal of people proposing these reforms is, I think, pretty clearly to roll back those decisions. And it could very well happen. It would be up to the justices.
Now, I wanted to ask you, because you wrote a book whose title is, in part, The Myth of Judicial Activism. So we've talked about the politicization of the court and the way the general public is, it's not as popular among the general public because some of these decisions are so out of step with general polling. So why is judicial activism a myth, and is that different than the politicization of the court?
Well, those are great and complicated questions. So my argument in the book was that lots of constitutional questions don't have clear answers. And what happens when the court confronts a question like that is it often has to decide whether it's fair or reasonable to treat people in a certain way, or whether a right is sufficiently important to be protected by the Constitution. And it's not just writing on a blank slate when it addresses that question. because Congress and the president, if you're talking about a federal law, have expressed their view. Or a state legislature, if you're talking about a state law, the state legislature and the state governor have expressed their view, right? They pass a law and they're like, we think it's fair to treat women this way, or we think it's appropriate to treat gay people this way. And then the Supreme Court is going to decide ultimately sort of whether or not it agrees with that decision, but primarily, I think, how much weight it's going to give the views of these other government actors, whether it's going to defer to them or not. And if you go through the very complicated doctrine and the tests that the Supreme Court uses, a lot of it boils down to this question: do we defer? Do we trust the judgment of the people whose actions we're reviewing, or do we not? And so the thesis of my book was, you can ask whether the court has a good reason to trust the people, to defer to them, or not. And if there's a good explanation for why it's either said, we trust you, we're going to let you do what you want as long as it's not totally crazy, or when they've said, we don't trust you, we're very suspicious of what you're doing in this area, if there's a good reason for that, it's not activism. If there isn't a good reason, then maybe you could call that activism. And sort of the point of the book was that a lot of the decisions people criticize as activist, like Brown v. Board of Education was one, Obergefell was one, Roe, of course, was one. A lot of those decisions, you can actually tell a pretty good story about why it doesn't make sense to leave that up to the political process. Whereas with a lot of the more recent Supreme Court decisions, I don't think that's true. So I don't think you can tell a very good story as to why judges shouldn't defer to experts about what level of particulates is safe. That's an area where deference is appropriate. And when judges are like, we're going to make that decision ourselves, that's activism.
That's a very good explanation. And it does, I see how it's different than the partisan politicization arguments, but they are different things. But when you talk about experts, you could argue that the Supreme Court might need to listen to doctors a little bit more than they've been listening to doctors.
You could, and that was actually a big part of the initial Roe opinion. It was not so much grounded in a woman's right to choose as it was in deference to medical expertise. Right? That's Harry Blackman's version. An equality-based argument came along later.
Mm-hmm. Well, we could talk for hours because the Supreme Court has been so in the news recently, but I will end with one final question, wrapping up where we are right now. What are you watching for at this moment in time, July 2024? What can we expect in terms of changes to the Supreme Court or anything else that President Biden might say as he campaigns for his second term?
Well, I'm watching the election, really. So like I said, there's no chance that any of this happens before the election. What Biden is doing is making a promise for the future. So, the key question is whether Biden wins, and there's uncertainty as to whether he's even going to be the candidate. So I think we need to see what the Democratic Party does. And I hope that they can get together and coalesce around court reform, because I think that's a great idea.
Kermit Roosevelt, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate your explanations on all of this.
Thanks for having me.